Okay, so it looks like we've got quite a few folks in here so far. So I think, as people continue to join, we can kind of get started with introductions and getting everyone oriented here, since I know that we may have some non-Duke folks joining us. I want to get that out of the way. Apologies for any background noise. I'm sure that everybody is accustomed to this at this point, but we've got some more. All right, more people joining. This is great. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the second in our Women's Speaker Series with the Duke Innovation and Entrepreneurship Initiative. We call this Lessons from Entrepreneurial Women. And as some of you may know, this event is usually a half-day conference, but this year we have pivoted to a virtual speaker series. And again, since I know we have some non-Duke folks joining us today, I will, or for anybody who's new to us in general, I'll just introduce myself quickly. I'm Anna Jacobs, and I work for the Duke Innovation and Entrepreneurship Initiative, primarily on our educational offerings. Duke I&E is a university-wide initiative out of the Provost's office. So we are here to serve all Duke students and faculty across the university and across disciplines. We are not out of any one department or anything like that. We work with everybody across the university. So the purpose of this speaker series is to bring inspiring women to talk about their careers and how their entrepreneurial skills have shaped their careers. We know that representation matters, and so we want to make sure that all students have the opportunity to see themselves in an entrepreneurial career. And I think a lot of times too, these talks can alter how we think about what an entrepreneurial career looks like and is. So we are very lucky to be continuing the series today with Milagros Brown, whom I will introduce in just a moment. I also want to mention that we have one remaining talk next week on the 8th at 11 a.m. We'll be hosting Anna Wilson, who's currently the head of people programs at DoorDash. She is not an entrepreneur, but she's going to talk about how we can all employ entrepreneurial skills in our careers, regardless of what we're doing. So this session will be recorded, and we'll send out the link to it on our YouTube channel after the talk. We're unfortunately unable to use live auto captioning at the moment. We're still kind of figuring that out and how it works. But again, when we upload this to our YouTube channel, we will be sure to add captions there, and then we'll send out a transcript as well after the event. So now I will introduce Milagros. Milagros Brown is a veteran of political campaigns and strategic fundraising. Her time spent in the major donor world in both politics and nonprofits provided a unique view into the intersection of money and influence, which now fuels her work. After November is a direct result of more than a decade of insight into the mechanisms that run and fund political campaigns, understanding who is an insider and who is being left out of the process. Our mission is to level the playing field, and speaking in Milagros's voice, our mission is to level the playing field of political access through information and community. Prior to founding After November, Milagros worked with the Lopez Family Foundation, the Democratic National Committee, Rock the Vote, and the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. She holds a BA in history from Duke University and currently resides in Silver Spring, Maryland. So Milagros, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And so nice to meet all of you this afternoon. I wish that we were in person and that we could do this face-to-face, but I know that that'll come in the future, and hopefully I'll get to meet a lot of you in person in the future. So yes, Anna did such a great job of giving an overview of my background. As she mentioned, I'm the founder of After November, which is a very early stage startup. But I'm also hoping that in this conversation or in this Zoom session, that it feels as much of a conversation as possible, and that you really walk away not just with me having a monologue, but that it is full of tools that you can actually like practically apply in whatever you're hoping to do in terms of networking and next steps. So because the topic is networking, I wanted to kind of kick things off with a question and just open up for dialogue right from the beginning, and see what networking means to you. Is it something that feels scary, overwhelming? Do you get really excited about the idea of networking? Do you love networking? Is it something that you dread? So I'd be really curious to hear from you guys. If you want to just go ahead and share that in the comments. So just to give a little bit more of my background, as Anna mentioned, I live in Silver Spring, which is just outside of Washington, D.C., for those of you who aren't that familiar with the area, and really important to who I am. I'm a mom of one 3-year-old little girl, and I'm expecting our second in June. My husband went to Howard University, and he also went to Howard for business school. So we have a lot of ties just kind of organically from being in Washington, D.C. There's a ton of Duke alumni who live in this area, and a ton of Howard people who live here. So we have a network that happened really organically. So the definition of network really means a variety of things to us. In terms of my career trajectory, when I first graduated, I immediately started working in politics. And I wanted to give just a little bit of backstory in that, because often when we tell the story of who we are, we kind of focus on the accolades and the things that may sound impressive to others, but like, what does the starting point look like? So my starting point, if I reflect back 20 years ago, I was on campus and really involved with a lot of the cultural affinity groups. As a result, there were the presidential elections in 2000, and I really wanted to be involved in those elections. So on my own, I believe I reached out to maybe the North Carolina Democratic Party at the time and tried to see what programming I could bring to campus. So to that extent, I got involved with voter registration efforts and civic engagement conversations through the party that I was bringing to campus. And I would really say that really shaped the whole trajectory of my career. Showing up, being curious, being, ambitious in some ways, really provided a whole trajectory in terms of jobs that I had during the course of my decade of working in politics. So, as Anna mentioned, I've worked at the DSCC, the DNC, for the Lopez family, and a variety of other entities. But I would say the majority of those jobs I got through my network. It was really rare that I ever cold applied to a job and didn't have a connection that was advocating for me. And part of that is how politics functions, right? It's the nuances of the industry that I was in. But part of that is really reflective of any industry. Those relationships that you make at any stage in your career, how you show up professionally and how you show up personally, really can set a whole, a whole trajectory of opportunities that you may or may not be aware of, and people advocating on your behalf. So to that extent, I also just wanted to point out that when I started in politics, I was fresh out of college. Politics is a very social profession. And I tried to show up as authentically as I could, being that I was in my early 20s. I did not attend a bunch of kind of social gatherings with my coworkers because I had a bunch of friends in DC already. So that is to say that networking doesn't have to follow a rule book. You don't have to throw yourself in, devote your total personal life and your professional life to networking. You can do it in a way that feels organic and comfortable to you. And I still, even though I maintained a number of professional relationships and kept some boundaries around my personal life, I still was able to make really, really meaningful and long-lasting connections. So I see we have a response in the chat about what networking means or feels like to you. Okay, Amanda, thanks for sharing. You said, I love talking to people, but when it turns to business from casual conversation, I feel awkward. That is totally fair. Networking can feel awkward. It can feel like you are a walking resume, or that you're a walking pitch deck of yourself. Networking equates trying to sell yourself. Yes, so it can feel like maybe you're a salesperson of yourself. And so my goal through this session is to really take the edges off of what networking means, to soften it for you, to make it feel more personal and relatable, so that you can show up as yourself and get and initiate relationships that are meaningful and that can serve you for even decades throughout your whole trajectory. So this is so awesome, Anna. Thank you so much for organizing all of these talks. When I was thinking about what does networking mean in the context of lead, innovate, and grow, I know that there was a speaker who talked about leadership in the first session. Next session will be about a nonlinear career trajectory. So like, what does networking mean in the scope of these conversations that are being had? And particularly in the spaces that you all occupy at Duke or at other universities in the area, you're in spaces where you're getting a lot of tools, whether those are academic, whether there are tools that are inspiring to you, whether they call you to action, whether they're sparking your interest, or you're beginning to feel your intellectual curiosity about a particular subject matter. But basically, there are a ton of resources that are available to you. And so in this moment, what do you do once you have all of these resources? How do you take that on to whatever your next steps are? I also wanted to have this conversation around networking because I recently participated or was a listener in a Zoom session that the Duke Alumni Network had put together, which brought together a number of professionals who were talking about having a career pivot during COVID. Certainly COVID has given us a lot of us an opportunity to maybe rethink what we're passionate about, or add layers to the work that we're doing, or maybe even step away from things that maybe had driven us personally or professionally for a while. And so while it's all completely, of value to hear of other people's stories, a lot of the questions that I saw in the chat in that session really were about how do I even start this process? Where do I go? How do I leverage my networks? How do I reach out to other alumni? How do I reach out to other professionals? How many times do I send a LinkedIn message? And really, like, how do I build a network, right? So we may have ambitious goals, but how do we get there? So I thought, kind of taking a step back, and whenever there's we want to move on to next steps, we have to really think about what are we doing right now that's helping me prepare for that? And in this moment, what are you participating in? What are your goals from whatever you're participating in right now? Do you have clarity on what you want next, or are you still trying to figure it out? Having these conversations with ourselves about where we are in our professional development, what confusion we may have, or what clarity we may have, we have to first start with ourselves before we can really step into the process of networking. And generally, there's no wrong answer, but just having clarity as to I am confused, or this is clear to me. So almost a kind of moment of, before you begin networking, really network with yourself and having a conversation about knowing yourself first. And then from there, the second point that I wanted to bring up was about backtracking from goals. So without knowing the backstory on the participants on this call, many of you probably have individual aspirations or ambitions for what's next as it relates to even joining us this afternoon. So questions that you may be asking yourself right now: are you seeking to have a career transition? Or potentially, if you're an undergrad, are you seeking your first job? Because this is the Duke Innovation and Entrepreneurship Initiative, are you seeking help with a startup? Do you have an early stage idea that you need, some resources in terms of intellectual resources, financial resources, etc.? Right now, are you in a period of professional exploration? Or potentially, Is this a moment where you're immersed and want to look for educational opportunities as a next step? Obviously, the answer is different from each of you. You can feel free to share as much as you want in the chat or not. But in terms of what comes next, often when answering these questions, I feel that it's important to look for role models who model the success that feels right to you based on your own personality and your own interests. Looking at role models who have achieved professional and career trajectories that feel inspiring to you. Those who role models don't have to exist in a linear sense. Obviously, professional role models are ones that we often look at, particularly as we think of networking, but also those who perhaps have personal lives that they're able to balance both their professional and their personal lives. We aren't linear people. So I think when we look at role models, it's important to find people who potentially exist in the fullness that we wish to exist in our own lives. So when you look at these folks that you may have a personal connection to, or maybe someone that you aren't connected to, but you've done research and you admire their own trajectories, excuse me. From there, you can take those the architecture of what they've created and then define your own story to see what next steps you can create, and then start building your network to help you meet those benchmarks and goals. So another question for you guys. Given the idea of asking yourself the question, where am I right now in this process? And what I'm hoping to achieve next. I'm curious if you're open to sharing, or certainly just to think on it yourself, what success looks like in your next step. So is that after Duke? Is that right now in the middle of your professional career? What does success look like in the bigger picture? And have you thought about identifying role models who exhibit or show those metrics of success? So we can certainly talk about later in this session things that resonate with you. But when it comes to networking, I think there's some common misconceptions. Often, as was noted earlier, it feels like sales. So I think the idea in sort of a really classic sense of networking is that you attend an event or some sort of cocktail or happy hour pre-COVID world, and you're pitching yourself. You're saying your name, you're saying your attributes, and main bullet points that may sound attractive to other people. But I've done fundraising. I've often worked in capital raising spaces. So when I did business development, I think one of the really important takeaways that has always stuck with me is that listening is such an important part of moving yourself forward. So, sales are not made from necessarily having the best pitch, but being a receptive listener so that you can then address needs. Rather than feeling like in order for me to network, I must present the most polished version of myself, you can take some of the pressure off and think of all the attributes that go into being a really good listener and someone who's very curious about the people that you're interacting with. Networking can manifest itself in so many different ways. Doesn't just happen in events, it's happening in this moment with us being in this Zoom together, seeing each other's names. There's opportunities all the time that we're connected to other people in intimate spaces. And so doing research on other people, being curious about other people's professional backgrounds, about the dynamics of how they've gotten to where they are, seeking that curiosity can get you a long way. Imagine reaching out to someone cold and trying to get a meeting, right? Like, let's say we're putting networking into practice. You found someone who you really admire, you're tangentially connected to them in your network. Your next step is to send them a LinkedIn message. Is that LinkedIn message going to be all about you, or is it going to be, about what they've done and what time and research you've done to show them that you admire things about them and you want to have a conversation? One of my old mentors said that so many of us do work that drives us and have so few spaces to really talk about it. I've been married for almost a decade, and my husband and I work in different fields, and we politely listen to each other. But am I truly curious all the time about the work that he does? Is he truly curious about mine? Not so much. So it's really exciting when someone asks you to talk about yourself. Like, human nature is to be excited when people are curious about you, when they want to hear your story. I think it's really much easier to get someone to open up and share insights and wisdom and be helpful when you lead with I just really want to learn more from you, or learn more about your story, and you come from a listening approach as opposed to a speaking and selling approach. And then the other piece of networking versus sales is that, networking, as much as it may feel like a chore, really, it has so much exciting opportunity to find your tribe. If you are into, let's say you want to work in sustainability. I use this because it just felt like such a Duke example, but you also want to be, like do club Frisbee or something. There may be a group that has a listserv of people who work in sustainability but are also into Frisbee. It doesn't have to be so static. I think if generations change, people recognize that we're not just defined by one thing, and there's a lot of things that make us who we are. And so in these professional spaces, there is now more space to show up more fully as a person. So look for your tribe, look for the people who are interested in the same things that you are. There may be a LinkedIn group, that is aligned with both your professional and your personal interests. But look for the people who beat to the same drum, because those conversations are so much easier. They're so much more authentic, and the relationships that you make can carry you so much further, because it's not a chore. It's not just networking for the sake of getting your next job. You're making relationships where people are invested in your success. And over, the tenure of your career, you may work for other people. I started working for other people, and now I'm an entrepreneur. You may have ebbs and flows of what you do, who you work for, etc. Those relationships that feel authentic will carry you through those shifts in your career. As you'll hear, I'm sure, from the speaker next week, our careers are not linear. They're not static. What you think you're going to start doing is usually not where you end up. And so having relationships with people who have genuine passions in the things that really mean something to you, those will serve you so much further than just getting to know the most senior person at your company for the sake of a promotion. So just this idea of being a part of a tribe. And then actual tools, right? So there are so many different tools. And feel free, if you have any questions or just any feedback, to throw those in the chat as well. But from the Duke standpoint, and really wherever you attend school, I had, just to give an anecdote, I had a good friend who during COVID, unfortunately, was laid off from her job. She worked in the design field. She'd gone to Rhode Island School of Design for her master's degree, and certainly did not expect to face kind of some of the financial trouble she did during COVID. And one thing, the thought that hadn't occurred to her is just literally tapping into her alumni network. Using myself as an example, I can't speak for all alumni, but I think generally speaking, there are ties that connect us, no matter where you go to school, and alumni networks are valuable. When I first came to DC, after working in the North Carolina Democratic Party, I carried a lot of those North Carolina connections with me to DC. I set up a ton of meetings with the folks that were recommended to me through North Carolina, but I also scoured the Duke directory. I'm mixed, so my mom is Dominican and my dad is Black. So I was looking also for people of color, women of color who worked on Capitol Hill, who could just share with me about their insight, their experiences. You know, I sent emails to anyone in the Duke directory who kind of fit my qualifiers, and you know, reached out with some level of tenacity. So I had a number of meetings, you know, with Duke alumni who wanted to be helpful. And even if they weren't able to provide me with a job or a reference, you know, they generally could think of people to connect me to in their network. And I learned a lot from just like hearing about their experiences. So again, that learning piece of networking is really such an incredible value component. And LinkedIn, as someone who worked in fundraising, you know, there's a level of tenacity about sending emails, but I think from what I have casually and anecdotally seen, sometimes there's a hesitancy if someone doesn't respond to you right away to continue to reach out. You know, as people are busy, so especially in a pandemic, everyone's trying to wear multiple hats. So I don't think that if you're showing genuine interest in learning about someone, you know, sending a few messages on LinkedIn, looking for different ways to reach out to them, I think that just only shows that you are genuinely interested in making the relationship. It doesn't show annoying. So you know, one email, it's never a one and done situation. You know, I would be tenacious in reaching out to folks that you want to get connected to, because that only shows that you're serious about building a high quality network. So from there, I feel like I've been sharing a lot. Didn't know if there were any questions. I'm certainly happy to answer.
I'm happy to jump in with just kind of an initial question, and I would encourage everybody else to, you know, drop them in the chat if you don't feel like unmuting. But how did your network and kind of like the state of your network influence your ability and your decision to leave a successful career that was, you know, that you already had, and you know, and pursue a startup, pursue something totally different and become an entrepreneur? Like, how big of a part did your play in that decision?
For sure. So, so my network is everything. You know, I didn't really talk too much, I guess, about my own personal connections, but so politics is, again, like I said, it's a really social field, but you know, now I'm more complex than I was when I was in my 20s. So now I have a family, I have other things that tie me to people. So it's moved beyond just, you know, meeting people at a networking event, but, you know, our families may interact in the same social spaces, etc. So it's a more complex and, you know, meaningful connection. That being said, when I decided to start After November, it was a bit of sort of a personal project. It didn't necessarily, I didn't anticipate it being a full-on startup. It was just a space for me to participate and own my own voice outside of kind of the work world. But I found that the conversations that I was having in the network that I was building online, in this social network, really inspired After November, which is going to be a community-based organization. So in terms of how my network has been of value, so you know, I had worked with the Lopez Foundation, as Anna mentioned. The Lopez Foundation was started by Jennifer Lopez and her sister Linda Lopez back in 2008. And it was a focus for the family, I would say, for maybe a few years, but they have become inactive since. But, you know, I still carry those relationships with me. So when you think about the impact of the work that you're going to do, you know, it's like, who are you connected to in a way that people are still interested, like you've been having organic conversations with them around a particular topic. So the Lopez family, I'm still connected to them. We still have a lot of common interests. I knew that if I wanted to do something on a bigger scale, certainly having those relationships are helpful. So I've kept a lot of organic relationships over the my whole tenure of my career that I think can serve to elevate the work that I'm doing now. I take relationships seriously. I don't value them based on quantity. I value them based on quality, right? So to that extent, I know that when I have something that I feel excited about, I can go to these high quality relationships, seek their advice, seek them helping me as advisors. And if they are bought into these concepts, they will help elevate the concepts. So I take my participation in networking as really just a relationship space, right? These are meaningful relationships, and I truly value feedback and opinion and support. And it goes both ways. It's not a one-way street. So without my network, I wouldn't be able to take the ideas that I have, I think, and believe in them being as big as I think they could be. So yeah, if that's helpful in answering the question.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Oh, and we've got a question in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, so what's the best way to help someone who's in your early career in your field when they reach out to you for a connection? So I would say, one, just fielding the call. As I mentioned, I participated in that Duke Zoom. And so I noticed some of the younger alumni asking for help on LinkedIn. And so I just messaged those folks that I saw in the chat and told them, we can have a conversation. And I tried to, dedicate a little bit of my time to having one-on-one chats with these young alumni who were really early in their career to see how I could be a resource to them. The other piece of that too is just the listening part of it, right? Like if you're young and you're early in your career, someone who has who's more senior, giving them space to kind of like have a conversation that's not perfect, that they're still kind of figuring out how to talk professionally, I think is also great value, right? So like one, just having the conversation with them. Two, letting them be nervous and awkward in front of you. Three, if there are connections in your network that you feel might benefit them, then do so. And, however that feels right, don't take on too much if you feel like, full on mentorship is not the direction that you want to go. But I think just allowing them the space to even have these initial conversations, it's just like, I think when you're first starting out, there's different varying levels of confidence as to, what's best in terms of how to ask questions and how to engage in these conversations. So I think doing it with an alumni who's kind of been in their shoes before and has been in the early stages of their career and can relate to those feelings, I think that's just like an incredible value unto itself. Yeah. So yes, I can understand in terms of wanting to solve problems for others. Yeah, this topic wasn't specifically on mentorship, but I do think with young folks who are early in their career, whether they're Duke alumni or from another school, I can understand the desire to like shepherd people along the entire process. But I think just take on as much as you feel comfortable taking on. If it feels like it's becoming too much work, then again, from a networking perspective, like it should always be kind of a value to each other, right? Like, and so you don't want to feel like there's too much value being taken away from what you're offering because it's become an unreasonable burden for you. So networking, so much of networking, I think, is similar to, I'm in the early stages of raising capital for my startup. And so really at the end of the day, I'm not fixated on raising capital. I'm fixated on making relationships with people who do this work and are supportive of this work. I know the capital, which is my outcome, will eventually come, but leading first always with the fact that you are in your role, your job is to make relationships, to make sustaining relationships. Because if we treat it like an equation where we can definitively take away some sort of outcome, then the person who's on the receiving side of that networking outreach, may not be as invested, because they'll feel like a transaction as opposed to someone who is fully being seen as a person and can add value to you. So, fully recognizing that you may go into reaching out to someone with a perception of what you may want to get out of it. You may have looked at their resume on LinkedIn. You may be impressed by the things that they've highlighted on their profile or in their alumni profile. But generally, when we start a relationship, where it starts and where it ends aren't the same place, right? Like there's so much more that goes into what people can give and share and offer. And I think that certainly having some point of view, but then being open to where these conversations and relationships can take you. And again, just treating it all like a learning exercise really is the most powerful takeaway from networking. Let's see, guys. So I didn't know if we wanted to try a breakout session or if there are more questions. I am happy to share more anecdotes about networking from my professional trajectory as someone, as Anna said, who's in the process of building a startup. But in a lot of ways, I am also in the early stages, even after 20 years of having a network, which I feel confident about, that I know is supporting the work that I'm doing, that I have been actively reaching out to in the role of advisors and leaning on their expertise and their interest and the credibility of having built relationships over the course of 2 decades. I'm also in the process of building my own new network, because I existed in politics and the startup space is completely new language, new normal, new people that I need to know. So a lot of it is going to school, right? Whenever you're doing a transition, whenever you are kind of moving into this networking space with a particular goal and objective, there's a heavy learning curve that I'm in the middle of right now. Terms that I need to become familiar with to show that I'm serious about showing up in this space. Again, I had said earlier that you don't have to be perfect to network, but you do have to show that you want people to take you seriously and that you're doing your due diligence, which is part of what I'm doing right now. So,
can I jump in with a quick question that occurred to me?
Of course.
When we first kind of were talking about having you do this talk, I remember that something that you said was around like networking for introverts.
Yes.
And I would love to just hear your take on like, I just have to imagine that, folks who would want to attend a talk on networking probably are maybe a little more introverted and a little bit more nervous about approaching people. And so do you feel like introverts are at a disadvantage in any way when it comes to broadening a network, and then like how to kind of move past some of those inclinations to sort of like turn inward at an event, for example, or, oh, I won't reach out, they won't be interested, or, those types of thoughts that I'm sure cross everybody's mind.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I would say I'm an extroverted introvert. And so look, at the end of the day, I would much rather be at home than going to functions. But yes, I can totally understand that. I think part of what I maybe was trying to convey earlier too is that it doesn't have to exist in these static spaces, right? Like Do you need to force yourself out of the box to go to a networking event? If it makes sense in the moment, sure, right? Like if you're equipped with either like if you know who's going and you know there might be one or two people there that you've been wanting to connect with. I'll give this as an example. The Duke in DC has a number of programs. Obviously, we used to do them in person, which I'm so sad we don't do them anymore. But they used to do like morning business breakfast. And so Janet Hill, who is on the board of trustees for Duke, and Grant Hill's mom, which you guys probably are familiar with. So she lives in this area. So she was a guest speaker at yes. Okay. So yeah, she was a guest speaker at one of the breakfasts, and I wanted to make the connection with her because I needed her advice on something, and I wanted her input on a project I was working on at the time. So I went to the event really specifically hoping to meet her. That being said, when I met her, I had already done my research. Like we had a personal connection that I had done the research to find out we had someone that we knew in common. And then I also was really familiar with her own professional background and how much of an advocate she is for diversity and inclusion, particularly on corporate boards. And so when I approached her to meet her after the event, I already had like a lot of information on her that made her, I think, really compelled to listen. I mean, she's just a helpful person in general, but I was already really armed with why I wanted to talk to her. And so now we have, somewhat of a thoughtful and meaningful relationship. So, your thing may not be like going to the event and taking home 15 business cards. It certainly was never mine. But, if I had a sense of who was attending the event in advance, I would try and do my research and see if there was some way that we were connected so that I may not have, as I mentioned, I may not have had, the most business cards in my Rolodex, but the people who were there were generally helpful and they were decision makers, aligning yourself with people who are in strategic positions of influence is important, right? Not just like getting to know a lot of people. So yeah, I was always, I think at this stage of my career, I've always tried to be like just a lot more thoughtful about how I'm showing up at networking events and really doing the research and making sure that, I'm not wasting my time and I'm also not wasting the other person's time, if that's helpful. Let's see, any advice on how to astutely network with VCs and other investors from whom you may later approach for fundraise? Yeah, so I'm going through this process right now. So I'd say one, I'll share what I'm going through, and then hopefully that will help with answering the question. So one, I participate in a number of networks myself. So one, I've been trying to be a little bit more active of a Duke alumni. But I also am involved in a number of women's groups who are in the entrepreneurial or startup space. So organically, right now I'm witnessing a lot of conversations from women that I can relate to in this particular arena. And as a result, they share advice, tips, lists of investors, etc. So there are a lot of resources that I get right now from just even being a witness and not a participant in these particular networks. You don't always there's so many now professional networks. You don't always have to even be like super active. Sometimes just being in the space and seeing the conversations that people are having are really helpful. And then it can help shape your thinking as to when you're ready to network, how to have these conversations and what questions to ask. So one, I'm already in these spaces organically where I'm with women who are like-minded, who are kind of doing similar work as it relates to startup, even if it's not in the social impact space. So that's one part of it. Two, my own personal network. I did political fundraising, a lot of donors, at the level that I was doing my fundraising at also are investors. So so there's some level of like having those relationships that I have not used for investment purposes, but that I have had in my political career. So I think the same way. So what I'm doing right now is like just really preparing my deck. And in the process of preparing the deck, I'm seeking a lot of advice from people who are in the social impact space, in the investor space, so that they are already invested in the outcome of what the deck is, and then the success that I have with the deck after I actually approach for the fundraising. So right now, it's just a lot of like, you asked for advice. Right now, I'm asking for a lot of advice, really, as my networking tool. My main networking tool at this point is really just going to people for advice. And generally, it's been working out, right? Like, I'm getting a lot of advice, I'm getting a lot of feedback, and I'm getting a lot of enthusiasm about the idea. So, I'm starting to see, I've been working on this as sort of a more formal startup for a couple months, and I'm starting to see people send me names. You should get your stuff in front of this person. I'm starting to see it change from just like, oh, this concept is interesting, this has opportunity. Now it's like, I'm bought in, I want to make this introduction for you, etc. So I think, astutely networking with VCs, again, it's just about that like relationship building and getting people bought in earlier in the process. Right now, my experience is with a lot of, warm relationships. So introductions that are being made from people I have relationships with. I haven't totally done it cold yet, but that's my next step. But I'm hoping that I do enough warm conversations, that the warm conversations really just continue to be warm because they're making introductions for me to other people, is kind of the goal, right? For it to be as warm as possible and for it not to be just straight, like cold, me sending decks without having anyone on the other side advocating or knowing that the deck is coming. So yeah, I hope that's helpful, Austin. It's certainly new to me, so.
Also for any Duke folks in particular, if you're looking for advice on, pitching to VCs and things like that, the Duke Angel Network is run out of Duke I&E, and those folks are super, super helpful when it comes to getting feedback and like even just understanding how that world works. So I would hope that like in the context of this conversation about networking, everybody's also considering like who on this call can help you. And, I'm one of those people, and Milagros is one of those people, if you're looking for that type of advice. So just as an FYI for everyone, we have those types of resources as well to make sure that you all are going into those conversations in a way that you feel good about and confident about.
Yeah, I mean, it's all, it's all new until it's not, right? Like everything's new. There's always a learning curve at the start with networking, with whatever transition, but certainly in the networking, in the startup space, we're all kind of inventing the wheel, right? There's more density in terms of startup language than there was 10, 20, 30 years ago. But certainly, the space for innovation, for thought, for even approaching networking, all of this stuff is constantly being looked at in new ways and doesn't have to be static. It doesn't have to be door-to-door salesperson. You don't have to wear your resume on your sleeve. I mean, at the end of the day, I know it's sort of a kitschy word at this point, but authenticity, showing up in yourself, that's how these things can really grow, right? Like, and you have flexibility. Next week when they talk about pivoting, you have the flexibility to pivot because you've kind of shown up as yourself. You put your best foot forward. You show that you're curious, you're engaged, you're intellectual, and then people will give you the space to pivot, to try, to step into a new space, try a new role, take on a new project, etc. So all of these spaces. And I wanted networking, even when I was working on this, I was like, oh gosh, networking is such a like static term. It just feels so old and a bit staid. And so I hope maybe this conversation, even me thinking about how to talk about it, was helpful in taking the edges off of like what networking is and what value you can get from it, because it can really add so much more value than just a transaction. It really can be a support network that you're creating through the entirety of your whole career. So I don't know if there are any other questions. I also didn't want to leave this conversation without, of course, offering myself as someone you can feel free to reach out to if you have any questions. I love making one-on-one relationships. I would say, going back to your question, Anna, about events, and if you're like a wallflower, I am for sure like in group settings. It's just not my favorite thing to like go around and say hello to new people. But I am all about one-on-one conversations. So I will share in the chat or after. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Milagros Brown. You can always feel free to send me an email. I am very happy to be a resource or a sounding board, even if we work in totally different spaces. Making connections is, meaningful connections is always a good thing. I always find such value from the work that other people are doing. So you can always feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions in this kind of arena or space. But yes, I hope this was helpful. I don't know, I would say I can go through my last kind of closing bullet points. Again, when just thinking about networking, where are you right now? Are you thinking about your next steps? Do you have clarity? Do you not have clarity? It's okay. There's no right or wrong answer. But at least you need to have the conversation with yourself before you move that forward. 2, backtracking from your goals. What are the goals that you hope to achieve from networking? Backtrack from there so that way you can create some sort of roadmap for yourself. 3, networking is not sales. It is the soft science of getting to know people, really. And 4, there are a number of tools, as Anna mentioned, Duke has a number of tools. I'm sure if you're not in the Duke network, there are so many other tools for our disposal. And don't be afraid to use them, and don't be afraid to reach out to people. At the end of the day, I think people want to help others. So lead with that expectancy that people are out here and they want to help you.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. Does anybody else, I guess, we can hang out for a couple more minutes if folks have questions, if anybody else has any more questions. But I think that concludes today's talk. Thank you all so much for coming. I know nobody is thrilled about more Zoom time, so I know that it means a lot that you all gave an hour to be here. And if you are here, you are in the Duke network in some way. So I would really encourage you to, I've been looking up the folks on LinkedIn who are attending, just to see like who came and who is kind of now part of our network and who is engaging with us. And so please don't hesitate to reach out. If there's anything that we can do to help you as you're thinking about careers in innovation and entrepreneurship. Obviously, if you found us here today, then you know about our next talk next week. So I won't say anything else about that. But hoping to see everybody again then. And we will also reach out with a recording of this session and the transcript probably tomorrow once that's ready. So you all can look for that as well. And thank you all again. Please, again, feel free to drop questions in the chat, as you're heading out.
Thank you all so much. Thank you so much for facilitating this, Anna. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, this is great. It's been, it's not been easy to kind of pivot our expectations, I think, around what this event is and what we want it to be. So I appreciate having such wonderful, compelling speakers to draw the crowd. Because I feel like networking especially is one of those things that it like makes people sweat, you know.
Gosh, yes. I remember when I first came to DC. So I I had my North Carolina connections and stuff, but when I first came, like I was applying to a ton of jobs because when you first start out, it's like a chicken or egg, right? Like they want experience, you don't have experience.
Yeah.
And so so I would just be, I would ask for a million meetings. I just emailed anyone who I had some sort of connection to for meetings. And I would literally walk the streets until I got holes in my shoes. I was so in it. Yeah, but I feel like the more experience I got, the less I wanted to just be out there hi, my name is, and then you're just kind of more thoughtful about who you get to know. But yeah, that first hurdle, getting through those first doors, those are it's kind of intense right there.
Yeah, and I think too, I lived in DC also for about 3 years after I graduated college, and DC especially is such a networking heavy city.
Yeah.
In general, there's events constantly. And so, I sort of wish that I had been equipped with some of what we've talked about today at that time when I was 22 years old and trying to figure out all these internships require even just an internship, they want 2 years of experience or something crazy like that. So how do you even get in the door? And I think it's all about network. So
for sure. And I also kind of wanted I know we're kind of having our own chat, guys, but I also kind of DC is such a networking town that I think it leaves a bad taste in people's mouth too, because it can feel super disingenuous, the relationships that you make, that people are leading with hi, this is who I am and this is what I do, right? But we're so much more than just oh, I'm a doctor at the FDA, I'm a whatever your resume is, right? We're so much more complex. And I feel at this stage in my career, it really doesn't matter to me as much what people do, because the relation, at some point you're the relationships are valuable, right? People are at senior points of their career. So it's helpful. So I'd much rather just get to know people as people. So I think it's easier to be a little bit more authentic, but I do wish when I was younger that I had carried that in my pocket, that I didn't have to lead with my resume, that I could just getting to know people as people. And towns are usually so small that, at some point someone's going to be able to be of assistance to you. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you again, Milagros. It's always so wonderful having you. And I hope that we will see everybody next week. And again, like I said, I'll follow up with an email probably tomorrow.
Great. Well, thanks, guys. Stay safe on campus too.
Oh, gosh. Yes.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.